Have you ever thought that God just sometimes doesn't seem to stop injustice or sin? I look in the newspaper this past week and the situation that's going on in Charlottesville, Virginia right now with this racism and these competing groups that are on the fringes of society, and we wonder why God allows things like this to happen. And when people get killed over things like this, just doesn't make sense. Have you ever prayed about anything without really having an apparent answer from God? Well, we'll continue this morning with the prophet Habakkuk, and as I arrived at church this morning, it was brought to my attention that I must have borrowed Pastor Marty's computer. And the scripture reference is chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 2, verse 1. So I'm glad that everyone's paying attention to the bulletin, paying more attention to it than I am, apparently. We will be looking at the prophet Habakkuk again like we did last week. So that's the book that we will be in. But it was last week that we looked at the Habakkuk's first complaint to God and how God responded to his complaint. Now, Habakkuk just couldn't stand the injustice of God not stopping wickedness in the world. Sound familiar, doesn't it? Well, God answers Habakkuk, and he said that all along he had planned to address this disobedience of Habakkuk's people, but he planned to punish them by using the ruthless Babylonians against his own chosen people. Well, we'll continue exploring the book of this great minor prophet this morning by reading beginning in verse 12 of chapter 1 of the book of Habakkuk, which, if you're following in your pew Bibles, begins on page 663. And this passage is going to end in chapter 2, verse 1, which I find a curious place to end it, but the verses that were added to the Bible, of course the Bible wasn't written with verses, and whoever originally put that in, put it in a very curious place. I don't know why they didn't make chapter 1, verse 18, but it is what it is. So we will read from chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 2, verse 1. And reading from the word of the Lord, it says, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made men like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of his holy word. Amen. Like all believers, Habakkuk was growing as a child of God. I think it's easy for us in hindsight to look at him and point to his many faults. But I think many Christians today operate under the same false understanding of God. And if I can step back a minute, I think I can take some comfort maybe in the fact that this great prophet Habakkuk didn't even understand God completely. So when we think we don't understand, we're in good company. But in chapter 1, Habakkuk was troubled at God's lack of judgment on the sin of his people, and now he's troubled at God's chosen agent of judgment. And this is the first point this morning. Sometimes God just can't win with us, can he? Well, excuse me. Habakkuk complains because the people around him are indulging in excessive violence and blatantly sinful behavior, so he cries out to God, "Oh, how long, Lord, must I call for help and you do not listen?" So God responds by telling him that he's working on the situation, and he's chosen to use this pagan people to attack and overtake his own people. Well, Habakkuk is not expecting this at all, and he has a major problem with this because he thinks that a good and righteous God shouldn't be using evil people to accomplish his will. Well, one pastor put it well when he said it would be like crying out to God about the state of the church in America and hearing God respond by saying, "I'll fix the problem by using a communist invasion of America." We would say, "Wait a minute, Lord, the problem is bad, but your cure is worse than the disease." End quote. If God would act this way, it doesn't mean that he approves of militant communist invasions. It just means that he disapproves of the state of church in America. You can be sure that God has judgment planned for the communist militants on another day. But more than anything, what we learn from Habakkuk is that we need to learn to trust that God always knows best. Even though he may do things that seem to contradict what we think is reasonable, he has a reason for it, and he knows what is best. There are a lot of things in this world that seem to contradict and just don't make sense to us, and I'll illustrate it this way. Now, are there any NASCAR fans here? Okay, I'm sure there's got to be some. Okay. Personally, I'm not much of a NASCAR fan, but I do appreciate the skill of the drivers. Since most days I drive on Route 81 for a total of 30 miles back and forth to work, so sometimes it seems like the Daytona 500 out there. Okay, so I can appreciate what these drivers go through. Now, you may remember back in 2001, the great racing legend Dale Earnhardt died. To refresh your memory, it was near the end of the race, and Earnhardt crashed his car at about 180 miles an hour. And I remember seeing news stories about it at the time that NASCAR experts said that when they watched it in real time, as far as NASCAR crashes go, it really didn't seem like that bad of a wreck. And they were shocked that Earnhardt didn't survive it. Well, medical professionals suggested that Earnhardt may have survived the crash if he had been wearing a special safety device called a Hans device. And this is a state-of-the-art head restraint that limits the movement of the head and neck in high-impact situations, thus reducing the chance of severe head and neck injuries and even death, like it was in the case of Earnhardt. Well, at the time, like many other drivers, Earnhardt had decided against using this device, complaining that he had tried it once and it was very uncomfortable. So his decision quite possibly cost him his life. Now, the numbers are staggering in NASCAR. From 1990 through Earnhardt's death in 2001, there were 19 collision deaths in a little over 11 years. That's almost 2 per year. Over the next 8 years after Earnhardt's death and the renewed interest in this device, the popularity of the device lowered the death total to 7 deaths over the next 8 years, less than 1 a year. That was because more drivers were using it, but there were still some who didn't. And interestingly, since then, in almost 9 years now, There's not been a single NASCAR collision death. The problem in NASCAR, we know what it is, and that is injury and death due to high-speed collisions. But there is a solution to the problem, and that is this Hans device. However, it took drivers time to warm up to this device and to actually use it. So, in other words, many drivers felt that the solution to the problem was worse than the problem itself. In an interview shortly after Earnhardt's death, fellow driver Mark Martin said, and I quote, "I would not wear one for anything. I'll just keep my fingers crossed and take my chances," end quote. Mark Martin was speaking like Habakkuk was, thinking there's got to be another way, a more comfortable way to stay safe. On to the second main point this morning is that it has to do with patience with God. The society that we live in demands things faster and sooner, and I want it now. I'm sure you know all about it. Cell phones, internet, computers, all those kind of things. They cater to our needs, and we are used to having things faster than ever before, and we quickly become accustomed to them. For instance, at my work, just this past week, we had major computer problems, so I had to use a more inferior computer in place of my original one, and whenever my boss wants information, as fast as I could get it to him sooner, he had to realize that I'm using a inferior machine, so it's going to take longer, and so forth. And it's just human nature. We get used to the speed that things are going. I think this affects our relationship with God. We expect everything so fast that when we take an issue to God, we want the answer fast. And oftentimes, too, we're so strapped for time that we only talk to Him when we have an issue. Many people don't take time to thank God for answer to prayer or to give God the praise that He deserves. When we bring an issue to God, oftentimes we want that answer now. Now Habakkuk, though, he models mature patience in chapter 2, verse 1. We see how he handles this exchange with God, where he says, "I will stand at my watch station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." In the popular commentary, or not really commentary, but a contemporary paraphrase called The Message, written by Eugene Peterson, maybe some of you have read parts of that, he tells it this way. He said, "What's God going to say to my questions? I'm braced for the worst. I'll climb to the lookout tower and scan the horizon. I'll wait to see what God says, how he'll answer my complaint." In short, Habakkuk is prepared to wait for an answer, no matter how long it may take. And he models proper Christian behavior in a couple other ways. First, he models the correct attitude by patiently waiting for an answer from God. He didn't storm away in a huff when God didn't answer his question right away. It was Habakkuk's faith that gave him the patience to wait on God. Our enemy wants to make us impatient because he knows that when we are impatient with God, we are going to miss out on his answer. And as a result, our faith will not be strengthened. It's the same faith and patience that we as believers in Christ must model as witnesses, as an example for all the world to see. I think the admirable thing about Habakkuk is that he brings his concern to God, which is a misunderstanding of the sovereignty of God over evil in the world. And Habakkuk does so with the expectation to be corrected. This is a sure sign of a mature believer. This is a person who is discerning enough to know that something doesn't quite seem right here, but he has enough faith to place the burden of proof on himself rather than on God. Basically, in other words, Habakkuk is saying, God, something here just doesn't quite seem right. Either you're wrong or I'm wrong, and I know that you can't be wrong, so please correct me, because I want to know more about you, God, more completely. That was part of the reason that we had gone through the short series on the Trinity a few weeks back. It's an effort to know God even better, the three persons of the Trinity. How can we pray to Him better if we don't know to whom we are praying to? And the attitude of Habakkuk here is an attitude that we don't see very often at all in society. We always think that we are the right ones, and we put the burden of proof on others to make it right. Let us now shift our focus to the tower that Habakkuk talks about. In the passage we read about these ramparts, which is a word not very relevant in our day. Probably many of us have only ever heard this word in the Star-Spangled Banner. It's in there. That's where we mostly hear that word. But a rampart is basically a tower, is all that it is, from where a watchman will look out for approaching enemies. And in The Message by Eugene Peterson, he picks up on that and tells about Habakkuk climbing into this lookout tower to wait for a response. And the symbolism here is very strong. Habakkuk is sitting by himself in a tower in a place where he would sit if he were on the lookout for danger or the enemy. And he does so for a good reason, because God told him that his people would fall to the Babylonians. So he's trusting God, going up in the tower and now looking out. But while he's up there, he's also taking the opportunity to wait on God's judgment and to talk to God about what's happening. This is why I entitled the message, Tower Talk. Now, let's make this personal a little bit. Are you, metaphorically speaking, taking a position in your tower or the ramparts? God never once instructed His people to stick their heads in the sand. Christ instructed His disciples to follow Him, not to go home and wait until He returns. We always need to keep on the lookout for the enemy, but especially we need to keep on the lookout for those in need of salvation, because time is short. I know that we've been saying this for almost 2,000 years now, but we are 2,000 years closer to the coming of Christ. No one knows when God will send His Son back to earth. So if they are not ready, they need to be ready. And it is the job of the watchman to warn others. The watchman can only do so much, okay? The watchman cannot drag everyone to safety, especially against their will. If those who are warned don't heed the warnings of the watchman, then their demise is on them. The watchman at least did his job. That's where Habakkuk was, because he recognized the reality of God's judgment. And these are things we need to think about during our own tower talk with God. But sadly, I think many people don't converse with God as often as they should, and many people even live as if there will never be a divine judgment. Their refusal to accept reality doesn't make the reality any less real. Judgment is all too real, and no one can escape that. Consider this story about men who tried to escape judgment back in 1975. 75 prisoners in the town of Saltillo, Mexico, masterminded an escape plan from prison. For 5 months, they dug through the dirt floors of the prison without being noticed. Why there are dirt floors in a prison, I do not know. It's a Mexican prison. I don't know. But imagine their excitement as they thought that they had escaped. So they burrowed up towards the surface. Well, don't ask me how they did this, but the story says that they tunneled right through the floor of all places in a courtroom in session. You cannot write things like this. Needless to say, they were not free after all. And just as these men couldn't escape punishment, it is impossible for the unsaved to escape judgment too. Another story, I'm going to assume that everyone here has heard of Babe Ruth, the great baseball player from almost 100 years ago. There was a story about one time in front of the home fans, Babe was called out on strikes. And the home crowd was booing loudly, of course, and Babe played off the crowd's anger, and he turned to the umpire and he says, there's 40,000 people here who know that that last pitch was a ball and not a strike. The umpire kept his cool. Everyone expected Babe to be thrown out of the game for arguing, but he was not, and the umpire matter-of-factly said, maybe so, Babe, but mine is the only opinion that counts. The human race needs to realize that God's judgment is the only one that counts in the end. If only our society realized this fact, then we might see an unprecedented revival like we've never seen before. I want to wind it down by summing this up. Sometimes God just can't win with us, can He? Because we think that we have to understand what God does and give God His stamp of approval. This is a large contributing factor, I think, to the lack of blessing by God on His people. God rewards His people who willingly accept the plan that He has ordained for His people. Many times God chooses a solution that doesn't make much sense to us, and like Habakkuk, we question God's methods. Where we depart from Habakkuk would be if we insist on God acting on our terms, whereas Habakkuk was a model of a mature believer. He stationed himself at the lookout because God had warned him of the coming tribulation, and he patiently awaited a response. The enemy wants to make us impatient because he knows that our impatience is the key for us missing out on God's answer. He wants our faith to be weak as possible. Therefore, we must be directing our tower talk to God the Father and not to the enemy. This week, when you are praying about some trial or some injustice, or some concern that causes you to honestly consider why God doesn't do something about it, will you, like Habakkuk, say, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what He will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. You might be surprised what God would do when you exhibit this kind of patience and respect for Him. Let us now bow our heads and pray to the one who honors believers, who exhibit patience and respect for Him.